Okay, hello everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulty here. We were trying to get our Facebook live feed to work, but it's not going to. So we apologize for the few minute delay, but thank you all for joining us for the first day of our 5-day webinar series here for Pollinator Week for Quail Forever in Arkansas. I'm happy to have everybody join us today, and today we'll be having Jessica Cox, our farmer biologist 2 from Harrison, Arkansas, and Leslie Fowler, our Monarch and Pollinator coordinator based here in Little Rock, speaking today about the birds and the bees. This meeting is going to be recorded, and we will be able to post this later on our Facebook page for anybody that couldn't join us today. But if you have any questions, feel free to just type those into the chat, and we'll try to get those all answered for everybody at the end of the webinar. Ladies, go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us as we kick off Pollinator Week. My name is Leslie Fowler, as Ryan said, and I'm the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Coordinator. I'm excited to share some basics with you, and I will let Jessica give an overview of what we'll be talking about.
Thanks, Leslie. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Cox. I'm a Farm Bill biologist in Harrison, Arkansas. My coverage area includes Boone, Newton, Carroll, Marion, and Searcy counties, and my job is to assist private landowners in the planning and implementation of wildlife and pollinator-friendly practices on their property. So let's begin with a quick overview of what we will be covering in today's webinar. So Leslie will begin with a general overview of our native pollinators and why they are important. And I will follow with a discussion on quail and pollinator population trends, reasons for the decline in these species, the connection between pollinator and quail and their habitat needs, and then we'll wrap it up with a discussion on some best management practices that landowners can implement on their properties if they're considering doing any habitat improvement projects. So with that, I will turn it over to Leslie.
Thanks, Jessica. So what is pollination? So pollination is simply the act of moving pollen from one part of the flower to the next. And this is primarily done by insects. So here are some examples of the pollinators that we have in Arkansas. There are wasps, beetles, of course bees, and the most charismatic is the butterfly and skippers. We also have moths, like the picture on the left. We also have flies and other species of our native bees. Hummingbirds are also pollinators. And some mammals and bat species around the world are also pollinators. So just a brief overview of our native bees. So approximately 4,000 species of native bees are in North America. And to really put that in perspective, that's 4 times more species than all of the bird species north of Mexico. It's 6 times more species of bees than butterflies, and it's almost 10 times more bee species than mammal species. So our native pollinators have special habitat requirements, specifically foraging habitat, so those nectar and pollen resources, nesting habitat that I'll go into a little bit later, and overwintering habitat. So this collection represents approximately 200 species of native bees that we have here in Arkansas. It really helps display the diversity and the complexity of our native bee species. You can see how large and how small they are and the different families that we have. So Arkansas likely has between 400 and 650 species of native bees. Experts estimate that this number is closer to 600, and 400 is a very, very conservative estimate. But truth be told, we really don't know exactly how many species of bees we have here because there hasn't been a survey completed. So before I get started, I wanted to highlight the difference between generalist pollinators and specialist pollinators. Generalist pollinators, like the European honeybee, really don't have a preference, and they'll pollinate any flower that is blooming, essentially. And then on the other hand, we have specialists like this native squash bee on the right, and they only pollinate certain flowers of certain species and certain families. So we also have solitary and social native bees. So more than 90% of our native bees are solitary. And this really just means that each female constructs and provisions her own nest without any help from other members of her species. So she's kind of on her own. So bumblebees are the best known native social bees. There's about 47 bombus species in North America, and they have annual colonies, unlike our European honeybees when the beekeepers overwintering their hives. They are also cavity nesters, which means that they use tree cavities or abandoned rodent nests or the undersides of bunch grasses to make their annual nests. And they have the ability to do something called buzz pollination or sonication. And this means that they are able to vibrate at a certain frequency to release pollen more efficiently from our native flowers. And honeybees also have the ability to vibrate, but it's not at the same frequency as bumblebees, so it's not for pollen release, it's really just for them to keep warm. So we also have ground nesting bees, and this makes up a majority of our native bees. There's about 70% of those native bees are solitary ground nesters. So this means that they need bare or sparsely vegetated soil, depending on the species, to build their nests. And it really varies on whether they're looking for flat ground or vertical banks, and their nest configurations can vary in complexity. So they can either be a short tunnel or a complex branching system, and at the end they have like a brood cell. We also have wood and tunnel nesting bees. So this makes up about 30% of our native bees, and they use abandoned beetle burrows in standing dead trees or limbs, and some of them can also chew out the soft pith in dry dead stems from plants like elderberry or blackberry or sumac. So why are our native bees important? Why do we have this week? So the provision of ecosystem services is probably the most well-known one. You know, obviously they provide pollination, it provides food resources, improves yields of crops, and they also maintain 80% of our native plant species, which means that they wouldn't be able to produce seed to reproduce without these special pollinators. Our native pollinators also provide billions of dollars worth of annual pollination. And honeybees are not the most efficient pollinators for all crops or native plants. They're very useful because of their mobility, and you know, people can rent hives to be brought in when their crops are in bloom. But if you create habitat for these native bee species, you know, you might get just as efficient pollination. So why don't we know more about our native bees? Well, by nature, they're very difficult to study, so we're still learning about their roles and their importance in their ecosystems. So, you know, we're still kind of figuring out exactly how many species rely on them. So switching gears a little bit to talk about the monarch. So there are 3 distinct populations of the monarch butterfly in the US. There's the eastern population east of the Rockies, the western population to the west of the Rockies, and there's a small non-migratory population in southern Florida. So the eastern population overwinters in central Mexico, while the western population overwinters on the coast of California. So many people know that monarch butterflies have an annual undergo complete metamorphosis, which means that they start as an egg, and after hatching from that egg, they spend about 2 weeks as a caterpillar. After about 2 weeks, they crawl away from the milkweed plant and pupate to form a chrysalis, and then they're an adult for about a month or up to 9 months. And that depends on what generation they are. So not only do they have a life cycle, but they have an annual cycle to complete a migration from central Mexico to southern parts of Canada. And they do this through multiple generations. So in March, they leave the overwintering grounds and begin their journey north. And that generation gives birth to the first generation of monarchs that go on to produce the second and third and so on and so forth. So in late summer and early fall, the fourth and fifth generation are born, and this is the overwintering generation. And they're born into a state called reproductive diapause. And this means that they're not mating and laying eggs. Their sole purpose is to fly south to the overwintering grounds in Mexico to start the cycle all over again. And here's a graph that kind of depicts this leapfrog of generations as they complete their annual cycle. And you can see that Arkansas is in their spring breeding grounds and their migratory pathway in the fall. So this means that nectar resources and native milkweeds are very, very important to have in early spring and well into the fall so that we can help fuel their migration. Here are some pictures of their overwintering sites in central Mexico. You'll notice that the middle photo has green and orange foliage on the trees. Well, the orange is actually not foliage at all. It's hundreds of thousands of butterflies. And keep in mind that these butterflies, they have the brain the size of a sesame seed. They've made this incredible journey to Mexico, and they weigh the same as a paperclip. But there's so many butterflies that the branches are covered in them, and they're literally sagging under the weight of these butterflies. So biologists don't they don't measure the population by individuals. They measure it by area. So they do this in hectares, which is about 2.5 acres. So if you can visualize 2.5 football fields, including the end zones, that's the size of 1 hectare. So this is a graph that's produced annually by Monarch Watch, and it is a graph depicting the size of the overwintering population in hectares. So you'll notice that in the past 2 decades, we've really seen a downward trend of our monarchs. And we did have a good year in the overwintering season of 2018 and 2019, but we dropped back down again this past winter. And a lot of this, is due to a variety of factors. But please note that the 10-year average is still sitting at 2.8 hectares. And scientists say that we need a population of 6.6 hectares to ensure the continuance of this phenomenal migration. So why is this happening? Primarily, it's due to habitat loss. Untimely mowing and development will take away those important nectar resources and milkweed. The use of pesticides, specifically non-discriminatory insecticides like neonicotinoids and herbicides killing milkweed. There's also illegal logging activities in the overwintering grounds. Weather events like the untimely snowstorm that's shown on the right can really wipe out a big portion of the population in the overwintering grounds because they're so tightly clustered together. They're also susceptible to natural enemies, so only about 10% of the monarch eggs actually make it to adulthood. So it's important to provide high quality habitat so that we can produce more butterflies on the landscape. So what is Arkansas doing to help the monarch? So in 2015, we formed the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership. This is a group of conservation organizations, agricultural stakeholders, government agencies, businesses, utility organizations. And here's just a sample of our partners. And in 2018, they finalized the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Conservation Plan. So we're working on this right now, and the plan focuses specifically on habitat, outreach and education, research and monitoring, collaborations and partnerships. And you can see the full plan at our website, arkansasmonarchs.org. So I've been mentioning habitat a lot. So what exactly is monarch and pollinator habitat? So when we say this, we mean that it's a high diversity of native forb and grass species or wildflowers and grasses. It covers the entire growing season. So it means that we're having plants bloom in the spring, summer, and fall, and strategically designing those seed mixes so that it ensures that our native pollinators have a constant supply of nectar and pollen. It varies the flowers' sizes, shapes, and structures because, like I said, there are generalist pollinators, but there's also specialist pollinators that need certain species. It also includes native milkweeds. That's the and it's the Monarch host plant, so it's the only thing that the caterpillars will eat. And we're really managing it to benefit all pollinators and other wildlife species. So it matters because it's critically important to agriculture. You know, I gave a figure earlier for our native pollinators, and the annual honeybee pollination value is also rated in the billions. It really can increase conservation program benefits. So if you reach out to any of our Farm Bill biologists across the state, they can discuss the different practices that we can incorporate pollinator habitat into. And really, when we hear pollinator habitat, we want people to understand that great pollinator habitat is also great wildlife habitat. And it benefits all the pollinators and other wildlife species like turkey and deer, and of course the bobwhite quail. So we're also changing the way that we look at habitat. We're not just managing it for a single species anymore. We're really trying to do some great restoration work and benefit everything. So the connection between pollinator habitat and how we manage it to benefit pollinators and quail is really important. And this is when I will give the reins over to Jessica.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. I would like to start by thanking each of you for taking the time to join us today. With nearly 90% of Arkansas land being privately owned, it's critical that landowners like you take initiative to help restore and enhance wildlife and pollinator habitat on your own properties. So that combined with the habitat restoration work being completed on public lands, private landowners in Arkansas can help restore millions of acres of quality habitat statewide. And as I said in the beginning of the presentation, I'd like to start by taking a look at population trends for quail. Oh, one moment. Technical difficulty. Okay. So I'd like to start by taking a look at population trends for quail and insect populations over the last several decades. And I feel like this will really help set the stage for what we will be discussing throughout the rest of this presentation. So bobwhite quail populations, as I said, have been steadily declining over the last several decades. As you can see in this graph from the North American Breeding Bird Survey, populations peaked in about 1977 with close to 1,000 birds being counted, compared to 2017 where less than 100 birds were counted. And while quail are what we often call a boom and bust species, meaning that they may experience a couple of good years with higher population numbers and better nesting success, perhaps followed by a couple of bad years with lower populations and perhaps poorer nesting success, which can be caused by a number of factors. For example, extremely wet springs can hinder nesting success and cause lower population numbers. However, declines like the one we see in this graph tell us that there's something else going on. It's definitely not following the same trends that we would even typically see in a boom and bust species. So then taking a look at this graph, which shows the decline in insect populations globally, we can see this same trend. As Leslie explained in her presentation, there's not been a whole lot of monitoring on pollinator and insect populations in Arkansas. So this graph is showing the global decline of insect species. And there's a lot going on in this graph, but the main takeaway that I want you to notice is that globally, 41% of our insect populations are in decline. And because many of our pollinator species are insects, this has caused a huge problem with, obviously not only for pollination, but also for species, especially avian species that rely on these insects for food. And because both quail and pollinators rely on similar habitat needs in order to survive, it is no coincidence that populations of both insects and quail have been drastically declining. So as we see, both populations have been declining over the last several decades. So what's going on and why are we seeing such sharp decreases in population numbers? As I said earlier, there are three main reasons for quail population decline, and that's going to be habitat loss, weather events, predation, and natural pests. While all these factors play an important role in population trends, habitat loss is by far the biggest problem these species face. And I like to point out that quail and pollinators have always had to deal with the effects of predation or natural pests and weather on their populations. However, without quality habitat, they're not able to recoup the losses from these other factors as well. So quality habitat can often mitigate many of the negative effects associated with predation or natural pests and weather events. So because of this and because of limited time, I will be focusing on habitat loss. So with changes in land use and an ever-growing human population, habitat loss for many species has been occurring at an unprecedented rate. In Arkansas specifically, we have seen the conversion of our native grasslands and prairies into introduced grasses for grazing lands and hayfields, cropland, and plantations. These introduced grasses, such as fescue and Bermuda, are often selected for over native grasses due to their ability to withstand intense grazing. These grasses, however, do not provide the habitat structure that both quail and pollinators utilize for various stages of their life cycles. Also, an ever-increasing demand for food and materials has led to an increase in edge-to-edge cropland production and plantation production. These areas on their own also offer very little value to many of our native wildlife and pollinator species. In addition to the loss of our native grasslands and prairies, we are also seeing the degradation of our forest lands. Historically, Arkansas was dominated by open woodland and savanna-type forest systems. A lack of prescribed fire and management has resulted in the conversion of these woodlands and savannas into the overstocked closed canopy forests we often see today. Also, quail and many pollinators are what we call habitat specialists. This means that they require specific conditions, forage, or other resources to survive and reproduce. When these conditions are not met, populations can begin to drastically decline. Quail rely on early successional habitat to meet their life cycle needs. Many of our pasture land and hayland and croplands today lack this particular component. So now that we've kind of gone through the population trends and what has caused the declines in these populations, let's look at what quail and pollinators need in order to be successful in an area. So as mentioned before, quail are habitat specialists and they rely on what we call early successional habitat for most stages of their life cycle. Succession, in this case, is a change in plant communities as a result of some kind of disturbance, whether that disturbance is fire, livestock grazing, or perhaps disking or tillage on cropland. Early successional habitat is areas composed of early successional stages of plant growth. We often call these areas weedy or brushy, but in fact, these weeds and shrubs are extremely important components of both quail and pollinator habitat. As you can see in this picture, early successional habitat is the area in between the two red lines. We see the area on the left, which would be similar to cropland or your graze pasture land or hayland, and the area on the right, which is more mature forest. These areas alone do not meet the resource needs for quail and most pollinators. The area in the middle, which includes your annual and perennial weed communities and grass and shrub communities, provide many of the resources that are lacking in the far left and far right plant communities. So that early succession of plant growth between the disturbed soil and mature forest is really the sweet spot for quail and a lot of our pollinator species. So being habitat specialists means that quail and many species of pollinators require very specific habitat components, and it is only when all of those resource needs are met that you have quality habitat that will sustain viable populations. As you can see in the illustration, quail and pollinators have very similar resource needs. Nesting habitat, brood rearing and foraging habitat, and overwintering habitat needs must all be met. If even one is missing from the equation, you cannot expect populations to thrive in an area. Because quail and pollinators have such similar resource needs, and it may not even be directly connected. For example, quail utilize native shrub and thickets as escape cover from predators and the elements, and while pollinators may not utilize those areas for the same thing, they can utilize those areas for forage and nesting sites. And this is exactly why when we develop and improve habitat for quail, we are also providing habitat for pollinators and a number of other native species. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the major components of both quail and pollinator habitat and how they are alike. So let's begin with nesting habitat. There are three important factors to consider when developing nesting habitat for both quail and native pollinators. Those are vegetation, bare ground, and location. Native grasses provide the proper structure that quail utilize for nest building while also providing protection from predators and the elements. These clumps of native grasses also provide nesting habitat for many species of ground nesting pollinators. Also, these native grasses grow in such a way that bare ground is exposed. And while nesting habitat is often thicker than brood rearing and foraging habitat, which we will discuss next, bare ground is still exposed to provide easy maneuvering for quail through the vegetation and also provide direct access for ground nesting and tunnel nesting pollinator species. The location of nesting habitat for both quail and pollinators should be close to that of brood rearing and foraging habitat. So now let's look at brood rearing and foraging habitat. Three important factors to consider when developing this specific habitat is forage diversity and availability, bare ground, and location. Quail rely on both seeds produced from native forbs and insects attracted by native forbs. Therefore, greater species diversity equals greater seed production and greater insect production. Also, greater plant diversity means greater pollinator diversity. Both quail and pollinators require a year-round forage supply, so ensuring that you have plant species that bloom throughout the year, especially in the early spring and fall, is critical. Bare ground is a critical component for this habitat as well. Quail chicks must be able to move through the tall grasses and forbs to find insects and seeds for forage. Location of brood rearing and foraging habitat should be located adjacent to escape cover and loafing areas for quail and nesting habitat for pollinators. Overwintering habitat. So after the breeding season ends, quail will typically begin their fall shuffle, and coveys of approximately 12 birds will form and ride out the winter together. Three important factors to consider when developing overwintering habitat for quail and pollinators are distribution, size, and location. If you are lucky enough to have multiple coveys of quail on your property, you must ensure that multiple covey headquarters are available to accommodate them. The sites should be distributed throughout the habitat area, and these areas will not only provide your quail with protection from the elements, but will also provide many species of pollinators with overwintering sites as well. These areas should be large enough to accommodate multiple birds at one time, while still providing protection from predators and the elements. It's important to remember that multiple It's important to remember that multiple large overwintering areas for quail will also support a larger population and diversity of pollinators. Because wintertime is a hard time of year for any species, ensuring that these overwintering sites are placed adjacent to reliable winter food sources and early spring nectar sources for pollinators emerging from their winter homes is critical. The last habitat component I want to discuss is escape cover. And while this component may not be critical for pollinators, it can provide extra forage, especially in the early spring when their winter reserves are running low for our native pollinators. 3 important factors to consider when creating escape cover areas for quail are species selection, size, and location. Native shrub species can provide protection from predators and the elements, as well as forage for not only quail, but many wildlife species, including our native pollinators. Some species of native pollinators also use the hollow stems of some native shrub species for nesting sites. Size of escape cover areas are very important. They must be large enough for multiple birds and be easily accessible while still preventing easy access for predators. As with overwintering sites, larger, more numerous escape cover sites can support larger, more diverse populations of pollinators. Locations of these escape cover sites is critical for quail. Because quail are ground-dwelling birds and can only fly short distances, numerous escape cover patches should be installed throughout the throughout the habitat, near nesting, brood rearing, and foraging habitat, and overwintering habitat. So now that we've looked a little bit about what quail and pollinators need in order to survive in an area, what can you do on your properties to help these species thrive? So let's begin with a few best management practices that you should consider. Number 1 is grow native. Select species that are not only native to the site, but also adapted to the site conditions. Also remember that many native species often require less maintenance and input than non-native species. Number 2, diversity and availability. As I mentioned earlier, greater plant diversity equals greater wildlife and pollinator diversity. Wildlife and pollinators require year-round forage and nectar production to sustain viable populations. And remember from Leslie's discussion that many pollinators are also specialists. For example, monarchs require milkweed species for laying their eggs. Number 3, usable space. You probably noticed that location was an important factor in each of the habitats we discussed. Ensuring that each component is arranged so that they are readily accessible from one another is critical. And then 4, continuous management. This is definitely not a put it on the ground and walk away type of situation. Remember that early successional habitat requires regular disturbance. So continual management is necessary to improve and maintain that quality habitat. So let's wrap this up by discussing a few practices that landowners can implement on their properties to improve and restore wildlife habitat. I'm going to start with the obvious, which is native grass and forb plantings, but I'm going to breeze through this one pretty quick because we have a great series of webinars lined up through the rest of this week that will be focusing on establishing native grass and wildflower plantings for pollinators. And as I've already mentioned, selecting a diverse mix of native grasses and wildflowers that provide year-round forage for quail and pollinators is critical. These grasses and forbs provide the right structure for nesting and brood rearing and foraging habitat. For a list of pollinator-friendly native species, you can visit arkansasmonarchs.org. So most people probably don't associate forest land with quail and pollinators. However, our open woodland and savanna forest systems can provide valuable resources for both. Forest stand improvement can be used to restore our woodlands and savannas. Reducing the basal area, which is just a term used to describe tree density, and opening the forest canopy to allow sunlight to reach the forest floor results in the natural regeneration of many native grass and forb species that are still present in the seed bank. So unless the site has been degraded, there's usually no need to seed these forested areas. Prescribed fire can be used to maintain these open conditions. And in addition to providing forage and nectar sources for quail and pollinators, forest stand improvement also reduces the effects of habitat fragmentation, improves forest health, soil and water quality, and increases nesting habitat for many of our native pollinators that can utilize tree cavities for nesting sites. So escape cover for quail can often be utilized as nesting habitat by pollinators, so both should be kept in mind when designing these areas. This is also a great opportunity to use some of the debris from your forest stand improvement project to create additional habitat needs. The species that are often used to create escape cover include cedar, hickory, oak, and Osage orange. So let's briefly discuss a few different escape cover structures that you can develop. Down tree structures are essentially piles of cut trees that are scattered throughout open grassland areas. It's important to note that these are not brush piles. These are stacked trees that provide open, bare ground underneath them for quail to hide and rest in. Brush piles often contain too much dirt and debris for quail to utilize. You can also use your cut trees to create soft edges along the edges of forest and field. This recreates part of that early successional habitat that quail rely on. However, if you're looking for a more permanent approach to escape cover, you can select a diverse mix of native shrubs to plant in open areas. These native shrubs will also provide excellent nesting and forage for many pollinator species. Perhaps one of the most important things to keep in mind when establishing shrubby cover is that these patches should be spaced closely together so that quail can have quick and easy access to them at any time. For reference, patches of shrubby cover would ideally be spaced about as far apart as the average person can throw a softball. Prescribed burning. The last practice I want to discuss is prescribed burning, and this practice can be used to meet many objectives and is applicable on pretty much any land use. Prescribed fire can be used to remove thatch in preparation for planting and leaf litter and debris from forest thinning practices. Late summer burns can be very useful in setting back woody vegetation that has encroached into native grass and forb plantings. Spring burns often promote the growth of grasses, while fall burns can promote the growth of your forbs. But it's important to remember that not all habitat should be burned at the same time. Only 1/3 to 1/2 of the habitat should be burned each year, and the burning season and rotation should be based on objectives and habitat needs. So I'll end with one of my favorite quotes. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And this is especially true for quail and pollinators. As hopefully you can now see, while quail and pollinators may seem very different, they do rely on many of the same habitat needs. And it is only when we combine those needs with some of maybe the less tangible aspects of habitat establishment, such as time, dedication, and education, that we can really begin to see a clear picture of what quality habitat for quail and pollinators really is. So before we start with the Q&A segment, I mentioned earlier that we are hosting a series of webinars this week regarding native grass and forb plots for pollinators. Here's a list of topics that we will be covering this week, and for more information on these webinars or to register, please visit the Quail Forever in Arkansas Facebook page. Thank you.
Okay, Jessica and Leslie, thank you both very much. That was fantastic. We've got a few questions here in the chat room, and if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to type them in there as well. But so Val asked, do all bees show flower constancy? Must a pollen ball upon which an egg is laid be made of all of one pollen type, or can it be mixed?
So I'm assuming the question was for me. I'm sure that it depends on the species. I'm not 100% sure, but if you wanted, I could, you can shoot me an email, and I have a few reference books that I absolutely love. One is called Bees in Your Backyard, and that probably 100% will answer. But if I had to guess, I would assume that most species do not have to have everything, like all of the pollen from one specific species to create their bee bread so that they can lay their egg on it. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. And Suzanne asked, and it's probably for you again, Leslie, we have had no monarchs on our milkweeds in Little Rock this year. Is it too late? Can we still expect to see some larvae this summer?
So unfortunately, I probably would say that most of the monarchs, like the vast majority, have already gone through, but there is the potential for some fall larvae. So it's important to provide that diversity of native milkweed species and just keep creating that habitat. I had a lot of luck with my, few milkweed species that I had in terracotta pots this year. And I feel like it's just kind of luck of the draw. But the more habitat work that we do across the state, the better connectivity we have, and the more likely your urban pollinator patch will have.
Okay, and Val asked, is it just diversity of seeds and insects for quail, or are some seeds more nutritious and better for quail than others?
So yes, and while I don't have the nutritional values for the various species committed to memory, maybe one day I will, but yes, so there are seeds that do provide a higher nutritional value. However, diversity is key. So I wouldn't trade diversity for just selecting a few higher nutritious species. When you're putting together your seed mix, just make sure that you do your research and try to include some of those species that may have a little bit higher nutritional value.
Yeah, and just to add on a little bit to what Jessica said there, so the vast majority, well, throughout the growing season, the majority of a quail's diet, especially young chicks, is going to be soft-bodied insects. So the more diversity of pollinator plants or flowering plants that we have, the higher diversity and the higher numbers of insects that we're going to be attracting to that site. So that's extremely critical for having good brood rearing cover, which is probably the biggest lacking factor we have in the state. And those soft body insects and high calcium and protein levels are also very important for hens at the beginning of nesting season. So just that high diversity of plants to attract just the diversity of insects and the sheer biomass of insects throughout the growing season is extremely important. And then those different diversities of seeds that have different micro and macro nutritional values that quail are going to need through fall, early winter, late winter, making sure that those are available on site is also important. So yes, every seed is slightly different than the next as far as value, but they're all valuable in their own right and at their own right time for those birds to eat. Dr. Harris just said, great presentation, thanks. Val had another question. Should common milkweed be cut back in summer to stimulate new growth for fall migration?
So there have been research studies saying that yes, if you trim in the summer, it will produce more, but it's also important to remember that monarchs only need milkweed to reproduce. The adults actually can nectar on, a variety of other nectar resources, so they are not, kind of relying on milkweed in the fall. One can make the argument that fall nectar resources are far more important than fall milkweed species. Hope that answers your question.
Although there are still quite a few monarchs that lay eggs and have a quote unquote fifth generation as they're coming through Arkansas in the fall. So, having some milkweed available in the fall is not at all a bad thing either. Suzanne and Connie both say great job. We appreciate everybody else coming on today. That's all the questions that I had here in the chat room. So again, Leslie and Jessica, thank you very much. Did you guys have a final slide with the state map on it?
Yes, we do. So this slide that you're all about to see is a location map for all of the Quail Forever biologists in the state. So again, I cover in the purple part of the northwest part of the state, but if you're in another county, please feel free to reach out to the Farm Bill biologist that is closest to where you're at.
All right, great. And Leslie has statewide coverage, so she's available for any and all questions regarding monarchs and just pollinators in general and their habitat needs and requirements. All right, Leslie, Jessica, thank you very much. Great presentation. Everybody else that was on, thank you for joining us today. And as they said, please register and join us for the next few days worth of webinars. The topics are going to be very insightful and should be very helpful for anybody that's just interested in creating pollinator habitat, exactly how to do that as far as site prep, how to make a seed mix, planting methodologies. And then on Friday, we're going to wrap things up with programs that are available to help potentially with cost share or with seed and chemical to be able to do these pollinator projects on your own property. So thank you all very much. Appreciate you joining us today, and we hope to see you again later this week. Have a good one.
Thank you all.
Thank you.